Okay, so my name's Zittlau. I'm in the process of spinning up a freelancing company called The Workshop. I have a domain, but there's nothing on it yet, so if you Google, you're not going to find it yet. You can find me on Twitter at Zittlau, or you can hit me up on email at ben@zittlau.ca. Today I'm going to be talking just about kind of what's happened in Ruby since we last had one of these Jaeger Bee meetups. So I'll get into it. We're going to go through two parts. So part one, I'm just going to kind of go through some of the new features that were added. I'm going to focus more on features and performance, and I'll talk about that a little bit during it. And then in the second half, I'm going to take some time just to kind of look behind the scenes and talk a bit about like how does something like this happen? If there's a new feature in Ruby, like what was the process of that feature actually getting proposed and approved and landed into Ruby? Just because like it's an open source project, so we can actually see behind the scenes really as well, which is one of the really cool things of open source. So let's get into it. So based on my email history, it looks like it was summer 2016 that we officially decided to put Jaeger Bee on hold the last time. And then since then, there's been 3 minor version releases, 2.4, 2.5, 2.6. As you can see, each of those happened on Christmas, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. January 2019, on the right side of the timeline, is now where we're back into the game. So first of all, something that's important to understand is Ruby does not use semver. So they use their own slightly different versioning definition. They also only started using this, I think, 2.2, so anything before 2.2 doesn't follow this, anything since 2.2 should. So basically they have major versions, which they describe as being reserved for special events. Since they've started using this versioning scheme, there's never been a major version increment. The minor version, as you kind of saw on the other slide, they release every Christmas, but an important difference from semver is that minor versions can be API incompatible, so they can cause breaking changes to your application. Don't assume that it is semver and you can increment a minor version without things breaking. And then instead of patch, they call it teeny, which is just like API compatible security or bug fixes. So we've had 3 minor version increments again, and again, those are not necessarily API compatible changes. So we're going to go through each of these minor versions, just kind of look at what got changed. I'm not doing a complete look at everything that got changed. So if you want to see everything that got changed, you can look at the release notes. They're very clear. And also I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. So if there's something that you see me talking about and you want to know a little bit more about it, either go look up on the Ruby changelog or just blogs. Pretty much everything, every time something lands, a bunch of people write blogs about it, explaining what you can do with it. Or just ask me a question and I can go into it more. Feel free to ask questions as I go. So to kick off, 2.4.0, so this would have been Christmas 2016. So one of the things that they added was a binding.irb. So for Ruby, a lot of people use something called pry, which is just another kind of REPL that you can use to help you debug your code or try things out in a console. But the default one that's there is IRB, which is interactive Ruby. I can't remember if the B means anything or not. Anyway, so with pry, you'd go binding.pry. So in 2.4, they added an IRB binding, so you can do the same thing, binding.irb. And what happens when it hits that, just takes you into a debugger where you can look at what's going on. Another nice thing around in 2.4 is they unified the integer class. So basically, there used to be big num and fixed num. Fixed num were integers below a certain size, big num were integers over a certain size, and it was up to the developer to kind of manage that. As of 2.4, they're both just integer, and that's hidden behind the APIs of integer. They're both still there, actually, but the developer experience, you just work with integers. So that's pretty nice. This is just creating a large enough integer that it would be a big num in pre to Ruby 2.4. And that was basically it. 2.4 didn't have a ton in it. So 2.5, so this was about a year ago, Christmas 2017. So this was a really nice thing. I don't know how much you guys have played around with rescue and ensure in Ruby. Just a quick call out, don't use exceptions for flow control because they're very slow. But when you are using them to deal with the errors, there's a pretty nice syntax when you're writing methods where you can rescue without having to create a new block. You just like inside you do def, whatever, and then kind of at that same indentation level you can do rescue. But you couldn't do that in like do end blocks. So in like procs or lambdas, if you want to do a rescue, you had to create a begin, rescue, end. So in 2.5 they brought it so like when you're working with a lambda, you don't need to do a begin end. You can actually do like a rescue or an ensure directly in the lambda. It just cleans up the boilerplate. Like as you can see, like this version I think is just as clear about what the intention of the code is, and it's just less boilerplate that your eye has to parse through. Yield self. This is the one that I could talk about a lot more. But as you can kind of see, it kind of feels a lot like the callback hell in JavaScript and how we brought in promises to kind of get rid of the callback hell. It's a very similar thing in what it's doing, and it's kind of a functional programming kind of idea. So before, if I was doing something, this is an example of like fetching a URL, grabbing some JSON from a URL. It's a pretty common thing that you do against an API. And basically before you'd have to like grab that URL, get the body, and then JSON parse it. So there's a few different ways you could do that. One is like nesting with all these brackets, which of course is difficult to kind of understand what exactly the order of operations and what's going on in it. You could also be doing it by like a bunch of instance variables. But this yield self, basically what it does is yields itself, so passes itself in. So if we look at URL, I think I can get a pointer here, right? Yeah, if you look at URL, so it's just passing this URL into this block, so I can do something with it, and then it returns the return value of that block. So from here, it's going to fetch the URL, give me the body, and then this return value is going to be returned and then pass into this next one. We're now to take the response and parse the response. So there's a lot of debate about how useful this is. If you want to look at the history of something, do some archaeology in the Ruby history. This is an interesting one to look at. So we could talk about it more later if you're interested in talking about that more, but it's there now. This one's really neat actually. So in 2.5, they added the ability that like for enumerables, so enumerables like an array is enumerable, but there's a lot of other things in enumerables as well. Basically it's just something you can iterate through. If you want to see if there was like any match or none, or if they all match something, except the block. So you always have to do a block. So here's an example where if I wanted to see if this array has anything that matches this case-insensitive regex of good, I'd have to again do all this boilerplate of like writing a block where it takes the values and then does this comparison on the values. In 2.5, you can actually pass like regexes directly to those. So I can go like array.any and give it a regex, and will tell me if anything in that enumerable, so array in this case, matches that, and that works with any of those four. So with any, all, none, or one. And I'll talk about this one a little bit more later, actually. So those are kind of the main ones that I focused on in 2.5. Just a real quick check, any questions on that stuff before I go on to 2.6? Yeah? Is there a shorter syntax for yield self? That's one, it looks really helpful, but it's so many letters. We'll get to that. Oh, there it is, okay. I'll do this backwards because Mark asked. So in 2.6, they added an alias to yield self, which is then. Now, in some ways, this makes a lot of sense, because if you're coming from like a JavaScript world or a promises world, this is going to behave like you expect it to, because it basically works like this is like kind of like a .then will do, so it makes it feel very intuitive. But it's synchronous. So is that a good idea or a bad idea? And this is, again, this is a really interesting one to look at. Matt's made this decision to go with .then as the alias, and of course someone called out, you know, this is confusing, and we can talk about that more if someone's interested. But yes, there is now a shorter alias for yield self, and regardless, I think .then makes more sense than yield self. One of the complaints about yield self is it was describing the implementation, not like the behavior that you're going to get, which I think is true. I guess I'll do the other one while I'm here. There's endless ranges now, so this is pretty cool. So you can do something like this. So before, if you wanted to get like everything in an array from a certain value to the end, you'd have to do this like 1 to -1 hack, which feels weird. Like, what is a -1 index? So it just makes this syntax a lot more intuitive. And you can do cool things like this. So dot detect basically finds the first value that matches. So I can go through this endless range and then say, find me the first value that's greater than 10. So this would return 11. Sorry?
Is that lazy? Like, it's not...
Yes. Well, the range definition is lazy.
There is a lazy one.
Well, the range definition is lazy. So by defining this isn't like in memory allocating. Yeah. So it's actually more the usage of the range that makes it lazy or not. Yeah. So that's pretty neat. Enumerable chains. So this one's another. It's kind of like in that same theme of like enumerables and iterating through things, where if you have like multiple chains, multiple enumerables, and you want to like search through a bunch of them, but maybe you actually want to go through them in a certain order. Basically, you can like chain these things together now and treat it like one enumerable. So when I'm doing this first dot chain second, it's not creating a new array, but it's creating a new iterator that's first going to go through my first one, and then it's going to go through my second one. So this is where like lazy stuff plays really well, where you can put like lazy things later in the chain, and it won't hit them if it resolves on something earlier in the chain. So that's pretty neat. Just another example here. So in this case, I have a first array and a second array, and I create this chained enumerable. And then again, I just look for the first value that's greater than 4. So this is going to find 5. And the way that did that is it would have gone through the first, and then when it didn't find the first, it'll go to the next one and iterate through that one. So again, this kind of looks like I'm creating a new array that's just all those values, but that's not actually what I'm doing. I'm just creating an iterator that will iterate through each of the things independently. This will work with any enumerable, not just with arrays. Just arrays are the most obvious example of enumerators. Function composition operators. So this is super interesting. Anyone coming from kind of a functional programming background, this will be immediately obvious to. Anyone not coming from a functional programming background, this probably makes no sense initially. But basically what these let you do is create like a new proc that's like a composition of like multiple other procs. And so basically what it'll do is it'll take, so in this case, I created one that's going to add 2 to a number. I create a proc that's going to multiply a number by 3. And what I'm able to do is now create a new proc that's a composition of those 2 procs. And I'll explain that a bit more, and then I call it. So what's going to happen here is you can see my add is kind of the inner function. So it's going to take the value, pass it to add, run it through that function, get the return value, and then pass it into the next one. So like if you have multiple steps you want to do, again, normally you do this by like using instance variables or a whole bunch of brackets. So it just gives you like a much cleaner syntax. And one of the things I've been noticing in kind of 2.5 and 2.6 features is there seems to be a movement towards these like more like stronger functional features in Ruby. It definitely seems to be a direction that they're interested in taking the language in. If this doesn't immediately make sense to you, don't worry about it. I distort this a little bit to grok it as well, but it can be a pretty powerful thing. And you can do this with both procs and methods. So you can do function composition with methods, which is pretty neat. It will always return a proc, though.
Can you do a proc and a method?
Yeah. Yeah. Any questions about 2.6? 2.6 was kind of meaty. Yeah. And then just a call out. So in 2.6, they landed an experimental JustInTime compiler. Unless you go all your way, you're not going to see this. It's off by default. It is absolutely, completely experimental at this point. It is not intended. Please do not use in production yet. In some cases, the benchmarks are amazing. They show like 4x improvements. So what this is trying to do is basically allow your code to optimize itself and get faster as it runs. So this is something Java is really good at, for example, and actually something that you get for free if you use JRuby because it runs on the Java VM, which does this. But this is building it into MRI, and this is specifically in MRI Ruby. So if you want to run it, you can run it with --JIT, or if you want to see what it's doing, you can go --JIT verbose. This is the best description of what it's doing that I found, which is really interesting. So basically, it compiles your Ruby down to bytecode, and then it uses an ERB template to find certain parts of that bytecode and like decompile it back into C, and then feed it into one of these C compilers that actually does the like runtime optimization. So that's how this is working underneath the covers. So interesting, we'll see how it develops, but it's definitely not at a usable place right now. I think you were saying Rails runs slower on it so far.
I think they were saying if you're running a loop over and over again, that's where this thing shines. But if it's something that's going to run once, it's actually going to slow it down. So
Okay. Okay. So I'll just repeat this. I was just saying if you're running a loop where the same thing's running over and over again, it runs faster. But if you're running things one time, it's not doing that yet. Yeah.
Where would you put this on the Rails? If you working on Rails
That's a great question. The question is, where would you put this? Like, if you want to run it with Rails, I'm actually not sure. I'd have to look into that. You can probably Google it and find someone, but offhand, I'm not sure exactly how you'd flag to enable this. Yeah, I'd have to think about that. Oh, that's true. Yes, you can do that. You can set the Ruby opt. So there's an environment variable called Ruby opt. You can add this to Ruby opt, and that would make it run for Rails. That's a good point. Yeah. So just on performance, I'm not going to read through these. I'm not expecting you to read these off the slide. But these are the performance improvements in each of these versions. There were performance improvements in each of these versions. But these are kind of tricky. Like if you read each one of them, they sound amazing. It's like, oh, procs run 3 times faster. But in the context of the full application stack, I've actually never had a Rails version upgrade, Ruby version upgrade actually make my Rails applications run faster. It always seems to run slower. Despite the optimism I always have going into it after reading these things. And so I'm going to kind of not go through it. Like, benchmark your own use cases, your own applications on the new versions. Maybe they'll run faster, but they are working on trying to make it faster. Your results, mileage may vary though. Okay, so that's kind of the end of part 1, just going through all the changes again. So 2.6 literally just came out this Christmas, so like a week ago. So any questions on any of those? No? Okay. So in part 2 here, I'm just going to do a bit of behind the scenes of like, okay, so something like yield self or something like the enumerables, like what does the process look like? Like how do these things actually end up making their way into Ruby and becoming available for all of us to use? So first of all, a little bit about Ruby. So this might explain some of your questions about Ruby. So Ruby was created by this guy, Yukihiro Matsumoto, who everyone just calls Mats with a Z. This is not Katz, by the way. There's another guy, Katsuhira, which works on Rails. It's easy to confuse, but it's not him. He made Ruby originally released, I think, 1996. The 1.0 came out. So here's his purpose for it. I hope to see Ruby, and I tried to use direct quotes from him, because unfortunately it's actually not that good of a like centralized declaration of like Ruby's philosophy and purpose. So I'm trying to take the words out of his mouth to be as accurate as possible. So he said, I hope to see Ruby help every programmer in the world to be productive and to enjoy programming and to be happy. That's the primary purpose of the Ruby language. So Ruby is there from a very developer happiness and developer productivity centric viewpoint, not like a machine optimization. That's not what it's trying to answer. Principle of least astonishment or principle of least surprise. This is something you'll hear when talking about Ruby and kind of how decisions are made in Ruby. So basically the idea here is that anything should work the way that you would be the least surprised for it to work that way. Now, of course, if you're coming from Python or you're coming from Haskell or you're coming from wherever the hell you're coming from, your context is going to be different and our subjectivity is different. So this is something that confuses people, and Matt's answer to this is kind of cracks me up. He goes, the principle of least surprise is not for you only. The principle of least surprise, the principle of least surprise means principle of least my surprise. This is his kind of semi-broken English. And it means the principle of least surprise after you learn Ruby very well. So basically his view on it is like, it's the thing that should surprise you the least, not in the context of coming from Python or coming from PHP. It should surprise you the least in the context of someone who is a Ruby developer, and he views himself as the extreme archetype of a Ruby developer. So basically, it's the thing that surprises him the least. Couple other ones, centralized final decision making. So he is a benevolent dictator for life. Basically, he is the final say on everything. So this is kind of his comment on that. When you see Ruby as a software product, I think it's better to have one person who performs as the product owner or manager, gives his or her opinions and make decisions on its design. In Ruby's case, it is me. So again, he's very unapologetic about the fact that he makes all the decisions, and he thinks that's how you're going to get the best product as a programming language out, is by having one person who's making consistent decisions. And he's no intention of moving away from that. Ruby is my life work, so I'll never retire from developing Ruby. I want to be involved in it as long as I'm alive. Also, I want to create a system to let others continue developing Ruby by the time I retire. There's an interesting backstory to that. Basically, it sounds like his view for the next step in Ruby isn't moving away from the BDFL model, kind of like what Python is doing. His idea is actually he wants to create an AI system that's going to mimic his own opinions. So he's working on gathering his historical data to start driving an ML thing that he views as being the thing that's going to replace him in the future. Interesting. So understanding like kind of like a bit of where that's coming from now, this is what the kind of feature request process for Ruby looks like. So someone proposes it on the Redmine. So Redmine's just their issue tracking system. You put up a ticket saying, I think we should be doing this. There'll be discussion on that, and then they have these developer meetings. They're about weekly, but it's just whenever they can book time with Mats, and that's kind of like the core development team. They get together with Mats, they discuss things, and then ultimately Mats will make a final call. Always Mats makes a final call. Requesting features, so they've got a guide on like what you should be doing when requesting features. None of this is too surprising. What's the name of it? Are there other things that are similar? Documenting it well. Kind of the things that should be fairly expected for writing any feature requests or any ticket if you're used to doing that. The developer meetings, so these are all posted online. You can go find them. One of the things I really like here down the notes is dev meeting is not a decision-making place. All decisions should be done at the bug tracker. So basically have a policy like no decisions should ever be made in a dev meeting. The decision should always be recorded on the tickets for the individual features or bugs. So you shouldn't have to look into the meeting notes for a developer meeting, but you can if you want to. Yeah, a lot of this is just basically saying Mats is busy, so don't waste his time. And then him making a final call. So these are just like some quotes I pulled out from a few different features, just kind of like reflect the view of Mats being this decision maker. So one, again, the referencing the developer meeting, this was on a ticket. In today's developer meeting, Mats said enumerator plus would be okay to add. This is an alias for chain, by the way. You can use the plus symbol instead of using the chain method. So Mats said it was okay, so it's okay. This is on the .then. After long consideration, I decided to pick then as an alias to yield self. So that was his entire comment on the ticket. And again, now Mats has made that decision, and it goes forward. And as you can see in 2.6, that landed. And this was a funny comment that I saw in one where someone was asking, you're just trying to get clarity, like, oh, is this the main blocker, blah, blah, blah. And the person's response was, if Matt says so, then yes, this is the main blocker. Matt saying that something was a blocker. So you see this over and over and over again in the tickets, this like, just reference to Mats as the authority. And there's a lot of respect for it too. I think it's a little bit different than some of the other communities where there's some kind of like contention between the developers and the BDFL. Like everyone seems to be pretty respectful of Mats and his decision-making process. How are we doing for time?
Oh, that's a good point, 23 minutes.
Oh, okay, I'm actually doing pretty good. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through one specific example and kind of show each of these steps. So we're going to look at the enumeral.any.all.none and kind of like what that process looked like. So the first thing here was proposing the feature on the issue tracking tool. So if we follow this was the initial suggestion for the feature. And basically the person was saying, well, grep can take these arguments directly without taking a block. It'd be really nice if select, sorry guys, I'll do this. If select could take a similar syntax. So he proposed this. Let's make all in friends more like grep was basically the TLDR of it. Quick aside that I wanted to just talk about on this, this change, which actually makes it a lot more powerful, is it's not actually that it accepts regex, like I said. That's like one of the use cases of it, but the change is actually that basically this form here, where you just say something equals the value, is actually what it does by default if you give it a single argument. It doesn't have to be a regex. So something like a range, you can pass it a range, and it will do that equal comparison to the range. So if I have like an array of a bunch of numbers, and I want to see if there's any value, in that, I can do that. So I'm just going to show this really quickly. So if I have an array, say 4, 8, and 10, and I want to say if any of them were in the range, say 5 to 9, it tells me there is. So that's pretty cool. Again, anyone coming from a JavaScript background, you're probably really confused. The triple equals operator is almost the opposite of what it is in JavaScript. In Ruby, the triple equals operator can kind of be viewed as saying, like, does it belong to this set? So it's a looser kind of sense of equality than the double equals in Ruby, which is why, like, again, I can do the same thing here. I can go, so those things are equivalent. They're just different syntaxes. Oh.
Shouldn't have touched that.
Rule one of recording, don't touch it while it's recording. You can never pay attention.
Good? Okay. So as you can see it, and some interesting, I like this proposal, hope it lands. And then there's, some discussion on it. So I'll go back to this. So as you can see, this was proposed in June 2015, and then December 2016, you can see it show up in one of the developer meetings where it was discussed. So again, in the notes here, you can see all the things, which there was a crap load that was discussed at this one. But here's this one, so they have in the list, add case equality arities, what it's called, to enumerable sequence predicates. So we can see it being discussed in the developer meeting, and then if we go back to this ticket, we can see the mention to it. We looked at this issue in today's developer meeting. Attendees were positive, but you see, but Matt's wanted separate methods. I also wanted to look at this one because it's kind of interesting to see some of Matt's thought process here. So in response to that, he goes, I am positive about the idea too, but as the duty of a final decision maker, I have to consider every option before the judgment. I see a few additional options. So it's just kind of cool to see him to kind of police himself and going like, I like this idea, but I'm going to take a step back. Like, what are all the other possibilities? I'm going to think about all those possibilities. And then later on, we can see him come back and go, okay, I made a decision. I took top option 1. Another thing I've seen that's interesting, and when he responds to these things, is he generally doesn't try and defend his logic. He just comes in and says, okay, I've made a decision, we're going with X. And I can definitely see where that might be coming from, because as soon as you start to justify your logic, other people can start debating with you, which can lead to a giant downward spiral. So I think a lot of time he just kind of says, this is a decision, just to create some finality to it. So anyway, so he came with his option 1 that he provided above, which was basically what the person initially proposed. And then eventually, there we go, Matt's made the final call. So we looked at that already. One of the things I want to point out for this one too is even something that everyone was kind of very positive about, this request took 3.5 years to land, right? So the person originally proposed it halfway through 2015, and it just landed in 2.6 on Christmas this year. So just keeping in mind, you need some patience with some of these things. Of course, there's a lot going on in a language like Ruby, and they only do these minor version releases every year, and someone has to write the code, all those kinds of things. So just to have some perspective on the length of time that might take some of these things to land. But if you want to get involved in the process, if you think that there's something that should be in Ruby, you can. This stuff is all open. You can see the logic behind it. Again, if you want to go down a rabbit hole, you can look at yield self and kind of its history. That was 6 years. It was originally proposed 6 years ago. It originally landed in 2.5. It got aliased to .then in 2.6. And there was like, I don't even know, 10, 12 tickets kind of involved in that journey. So it's interesting the discussions there. Just kind of summarize what I went through. So again, part one, we looked at what happened since the last Jaeger B, so in 2.4, 2.5, and 2.6. And then the second part, we just went through kind of what that process looked like and took one example feature that recently landed and kind of looked at the path, the journey that that feature went through. So again, I'm Ben Zittlau. My company is The Workshop. Again, don't Google that yet. Soon you'll be able to. Or you can find me on Twitter and email. Any other questions? No?
I like the slide on maths and the BDFL, but we never explained that acronym. And maybe as a follow-up question, why are all the best programming languages have a best dad for life?
So this is a really interesting topic. First of all, you need to be in a somewhat unique situation to become a benevolent dictator for life, right? Like, of course, like if I want to be the benevolent dictator of JavaScript, I can't just tomorrow go, oh, I'm the benevolent dictator of JavaScript. You know, there's a governance model behind these things, and governance models of open source projects is like kind of a fascinating topic. But the approach to it is basically trying to say that, like, I think that having one person who makes all the decisions is going to arrive at the best outcome versus having, you know, committee-based decision making. And arguably there's good results that come out of that. Of course, maybe we don't, the ones where it doesn't go as well are, you know, from survivorship bias, the ones that we don't see. So we don't know how many projects with benevolent dictators for life fail horribly. But like Vue.js would be another one, right? Where it's like Evan Yu, it's the one guy that's like driving that project, and there's a one guy project that's amazing to see, you know, the progress that he's made on it. The other thing that is really interesting in Ruby too is that he's very deliberate about being the single centralized decision maker for user experience and architecture decisions and not implementation decisions. So he's not going to his team and like giving them feedback or throwing out implementations that they've made. He stays up at that higher level of like, is this consistent with like the user experience? Is this consistent with the developer experience that he wants the language to have? So that's, I think, an important call out. You know, like if you want to go back to your company and be a benevolent dictator, I think that's a useful way to approach it, is just say, I'm going to care about the interface and the architecture. And I can go into the whole thing. That basically goes into what like technically an architect is supposed to be. So basically I view him kind of as the architect of the language, and that can go down a rabbit hole of the conversation too. So if you're interested in that conversation, bug me afterwards and I'll talk about that more.
All right, thank you very much.